death camps in World War II.
My name is Robert Forisson. I am 60. I am university professor in Lyon, France. Behind me, you may see the courthouse of Paris, the Palais de Justice. In this place, I was convicted many times at the beginning of the 80s. I was charged by 9 associations, mostly Jewish associations, for inciting hatred, racial hatred, for racial defamation, for damage by falsifying a story.
Professor Chomsky and a number of other intellectuals signed a petition in which Forisson is called a respected professor of literature who merely tried to make his findings public.
Perhaps we can start with just the story of Robert Forisson and your involvement.
More than 500 people signed, maybe 600, mostly universitaires, scholars.
And what happened to the other 499 of them? How come we only hear about Chomsky's signature?
Well, I think it's because Chomsky is in himself a kind of political power.
I signed a petition calling on the tribunal to defend his civil rights. At that point, the French press, which apparently has no conception of freedom of speech, concluded that since I had called for his civil rights, I was therefore defending his theses.
Forisson then published a book in which he tried to prove that the Nazi gas chambers never existed.
What we deny is that there was an extermination program and an extermination actually, especially in gas chambers or gas vans.
The book contains a preface written by Professor Chomsky in which he calls Forisson a relatively apolitical sort of liberal.
A communist is a man, a Jew is a man, a Nazi is a man, I am a man.
Are you a Nazi?
I am not a Nazi.
How would you describe yourself politically?
Nothing.
Preface that you wrote, whether you retracted it.
That's not the preface that I wrote, because I never wrote a preface, and you know that I never wrote a preface.
Yeah, we done okay.
He's referring to a statement of mine on civil liberties, which was added to a book in which Forisson, excuse me.
You are a linguist.
Yes, I used
the language you use has meaning.
That's right.
And
the language I use.
As a political liberal, or as someone whose views can be dignified by the word findings or conclusions, that is a judgment, and that is a favorable judgment of his views.
On the contrary.
Can I continue with the facts?
Yes, you can continue with the facts for hours, but I mean,
but there are a few
facts that, yeah, okay.
Well, let's get to the so-called preface. I was then asked by the person who organized the petition to write a statement on freedom of speech, just banal comments about freedom of speech, pointing out the difference between defending a person's right to express his views and defending the views expressed. So I did that. I wrote a rather banal statement called Some Elementary Remarks on Freedom of Expression, and I told him, do what you like with it.
So Pierre produced a book which all the arguments of Forisson were to be put in front of the court. And we thought wise to use the text of Noam Chomsky as a kind of warning, a foreword, to say that it was a matter of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of research.
Why did you try at the last moment to get it back from the book?
That's the one thing I'm sorry about.
But that's the real important thing.
It's
of
not.
course,
You mean the fact that I tried to retract it?
Because with that you said it was wrong of you to do it.
See, in fact, take a look at what I wrote a letter, which was then publicized, in which I said, look, things have reached the point where the French intellectual community simply is incapable of understanding the issues. At this point, it's just going to confuse matters even more if my comments on freedom of speech happen to be attached to this book, which I didn't know existed. So just to clarify things, you better separate them. Now, in retrospect, I think I probably shouldn't have done that. I should have just said, fine, then let it appear, because it ought to appear. But that's, apart from that, I regard this as not only trivial, but as compared with other positions I've taken on freedom of speech, invisible. I do not think that the state ought to have the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from it. I'm not willing to give the state that right, even if they happen to
But are you denying that the gas chambers ever existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech, and you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything like objectivity, or scientific objectivity, reality? As a scientist,
look, I'm not saying I defend the views. Look, if somebody publishes a scientific article, which I disagree with, I do not say the state ought to put him in jail, right?
All right, but you don't have to support him right away and say, you know, I support him just for the sake of everybody saying that, you know, whatever he wants to say.
Suppose this guy is taken to court and charged with falsification. Then I'm going to defend him, even if I disagree.
But he wasn't taken to court.
Oh, you're wrong.
But when did you write the support? I mean,
when he was brought to court. And in fact, the only support that I gave him is to say he has a right of freedom of speech, period.
There is no doubt in my mind that the example that I gave about this story is the Holocaust that did not exist is very, very typical. I'll give you another example about
how much of the American press believes that Faurisson has anything to say, or any press? How much of the press in France?
Since I followed...
What percentage would you say?
I'll tell you.
Is it higher than zero? Is it higher than zero?
I'll tell you.
Have you ever seen anything in any newspaper or any journal saying that this man is anything other than a lunatic?
I'll try to answer. I'll try to answer. I think that I just followed the case.
That's a simple question.
I followed the case 5 or 6 years ago, and I happened to see that Noam Chomsky was in for strong criticism, even from some of his supporters, for doing something which could be interpreted only in terms of a campaign against Israel.
Going back years, I am absolutely certain that I've taken far more extreme positions on people who deny the Holocaust than you have. For example, you go back to my earliest articles and you will find that I say that even to enter into the arena of debate on the question of whether the Nazis carried out such atrocities is already to lose one's humanity. So I don't even think you ought to discuss the issue if you want to know my opinion. But if anybody wants to refute Faurisson, there's certainly no difficulty in doing so.
I'm not interested in freedom of speech and all that. I have to win, and that's the question. And I shall win.
I'm just an ordinary mom who just thinks in terms of, I don't want to someday be holding my grandchildren and watching something horrible happen and feel like I didn't do anything. And I mean, it's obvious what you're doing. And my question is, on a practical level, where do you see the most practical place to put your energy? I mean, tonight I feel overwhelmed, like I feel like it's too big, it's too much to even make a dent in.
The way things change is because lots of people are working all the time. And, you know, they're working in their communities, in their workplace, or wherever they happen to be, and they're building up the basis for popular movements which are going to make changes. That's the way everything has ever happened in history, you know, whether it was the end of slavery or whether it was the democratic revolutions or anything you want, you name it, that's the way it worked. You get a very false picture of this from the history books. In the history books, there's a couple of leaders, George Washington or Martin Luther King or whatever. And I don't want to say that those people are unimportant, like Martin Luther King was certainly important, but he was not the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King can appear in the history books because lots of people whose names you will never know and whose names are all forgotten and who may have been killed and so on were working down in the South. When you have activists and people concerned and people devoting themselves and dedicating themselves to social change or issues or whatever, then people like me can appear. And we can appear to be prominent, but that's only because somebody else is doing the work. My work, whether it's giving hundreds of talks a year or spending 20 hours a week writing letters or writing books, is not directed to intellectuals and politicians. It's directed to what are called ordinary people. Yeah. And what I expect from them is, in fact, exactly what they are, that they should try to understand the world and act in accordance with their decent impulses, and that they should try to improve the world. And many people are willing to do that, but they have to understand. And in fact, as far as I can see, in these things, I feel that I'm simply helping people develop courses of intellectual self-defense.
What did you mean by that? What would such a course be?
I don't mean go to school, because I'm not going to get it there. It means you have to develop an independent mind and work on it. Now, that's extremely hard to do alone. The beauty of our system is it isolates everybody. Each person is sitting alone in front of the tube. It's very hard to have ideas or thoughts under those circumstances. You can't fight the world alone. Some people can, but it's pretty rare. The way to do it is through organization. So courses of intellectual self-defense will have to be in the context of political and other organization. And it makes sense, I think, to look at what the institutions are trying to do and to take that almost as a key. What they're trying to do is what we're trying to combat. If they're trying to keep people isolated and separate and, and so on, well, we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to bring them together. So in your local community, you want to have sources of alternative action. People with parallel concerns, maybe differently focused, but at the core sort of similar values and a similar interest in helping people learn how to defend themselves against external power and taking control of their lives and, reaching out your hand to people who need it. That's a common array of concerns. You can learn about your own values and you can figure out how to defend yourself and so on in conjunction with others.
Are there one or two publications that I, as an average person, a biologist, can read to bypass this filter of our press?
Now, if you ask what media can I turn to get the right answers, first of all, I wouldn't tell you that because I don't think there's an answer. The right answers are what you decide are the right answers. Maybe everything I'm telling is wrong, okay? Could perfectly well be, I'm not God. But that's something for you to figure out. I mean, I could tell you what I think happens to be more or less right, but there isn't any reason why you should pay any attention to it.
What impact do you feel alternative media is currently having or could potentially have? I'm actually a little more interested in its potential. And just to define my terms, by alternative media, I'm referring to media that are or could be citizen-controlled as opposed to state or corporate control.
That's what's kept people together. To the extent that people are able to do something constructive, it's because they have some way of interacting. I mean, I've always felt it would be a very positive thing, and it should be pushed as far as it can go. I think it's going to have a very hard time. There's just such a concentration of resources and power that